Remember when John Wayne starred in a war movie about the Philippines, directed by a man who would later be blacklisted as a communist, written by a man who was an actual member of the Communist Party at the time of filming, and Wayne, the man who would go on to become Hollywood's most famous anti-communist crusader, spent the whole shoot half convinced he was being personally targeted by a Soviet plot? He was right that something was going on. He was wrong about almost everything else. Directed by Edward Meitrick, written by Ben Barsman and Richard H. Landau, and starring John Wayne as Colonel Joseph Madden alongside Anthony Quinn, Beulah Bondi, and a 14-year-old actor billed only as Ducky Louie. Back to Bataan was shot while the war it depicted was still being fought, rewritten on the fly as real battles changed the script underneath the actors, and released in the same year that two of its key creative figures would become the exact enemies the film's hero was fighting against in fiction. Today we're counting down 15 weird facts about Back to Bataan, and stick around for number one, because the real general this film depended on for its emotional ending was, at the moment of release, still sitting in a Japanese prison camp with no idea any of this existed. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment, Wayne or Quinn, who actually carries this film. Make your case below. Alright, the Death March isn't going to walk itself. Let's get into it. Before it was Back to Bataan, the film was registered under a different name entirely: The Invisible Army. The title described exactly what the production was attempting to dramatize: the guerrilla resistance movements that continued operating in the Philippines after the official surrender. Fighters who had no uniforms, no formal command structure recognizable to Washington, and no presence in any newsreel, yet who tied down Japanese forces for years through sabotage and ambush. An invisible army. The title was accurate, evocative, thematically precise, and entirely scrapped before release. RKO's marketing department made the change, and the logic behind it tells you almost everything about how the studio thought audiences would respond to a film like this in the spring of 1945. Back to Bataan did something the Invisible Army couldn't. It connected directly to a name American audiences already associated with catastrophe and humiliation. Bataan meant the Death March. It meant photographs and reports that had reached American newspapers describing one of the worst military disasters and human atrocities in the country's history. Putting back to in front of it reframed the entire association, not the place where America lost, but the place America was returning to, on its own terms, with its own army, to settle the account. The title change cost the studio nothing, and altered the emotional contract with the audience completely. The Invisible Army promised a story about people Americans hadn't heard of, fighting a war most of the public didn't know was still happening. Back to Bataan promised something audiences already had feelings about, and a resolution to those feelings that the actual war hadn't yet provided when the title was chosen. One title sells a story, the other sells a reckoning. Most films are written then shot. Back to Bataan was being shot while it was simultaneously being written, because the war it depicted refused to stay still. Director Edward Dmytryk recalled that the situation in the Pacific was changing from day to day during production. Two specific real-world events forced their way into the screenplay mid-shoot. General Douglas MacArthur made his actual, long-promised return to the Philippines, the I shall return, moment he had been building toward since 1942. While the cameras were rolling, the screenplay had to incorporate it. Then, in January 1945, U.S. Army Rangers staged the real raid on the Cabanatuan prisoner of war camp, freeing hundreds of American captives who had been held since the fall of Bataan. Dmytryk and his writers restructured the film around this second event entirely. The finished film opens with a dramatization of the Cabanatuan raid, an event that happened in 1945 before flashing back to the actual story, which is set in 1942. The ending circles back to it. A film set 3 years in the past is bookended by an event that happened while the cameras were still running. Nobody planned this structure from the outset. The war wrote it for them. John Wayne would not use a stunt double for Back to Bataan. This was not a one-time refusal. It was a standing policy, and Dmytryk and screenwriter Ben Barsman knew it going into production. Their response was, by any normal standard, an extraordinary thing to do to your own leading man. They began writing physically dangerous stunt sequences directly into the script, specifically calibrated to be frightening enough that Wayne would finally relent and call in a professional. It didn't work. Wayne performed the dangerous sequences himself, as written, without complaint. One of these sequences became a specific point of friction between Wayne and Dmytryk after the fact, a scene in which Wayne's Colonel Madden is blown out of a foxhole by an exploding shell, filmed in a way Wayne later said he didn't care for. The writers had built a trap specifically designed to make Wayne back down. Wayne walked into the trap, did the stunt anyway, and then complained about the direction rather than the danger. The strategy failed completely, and in the most John Wayne way imaginable. The most serious conflict on the set of Back to Bataan had nothing to do with stunts, schedules, or budgets. It centered on the film's technical advisor, Colonel George S. Clark, a real veteran who had commanded the 57th Infantry Regiment of the Philippine Scouts during the actual Battle of Bataan, and who was, in any meaningful sense, the living counterpart to the fictional character Wayne was playing. Wayne heard that director Edward Dmytryk and screenwriter Ben Barsman were openly mocking Colonel Clark's religious beliefs on set, reportedly including renditions of the Internationale, the international anthem of socialist and communist movements aimed at the colonel. Wayne confronted Dmytryk directly and asked him, without preamble, if he was a communist. Dmytryk said no, but added that if the masses of the American people wanted communism, it would be good for the country. Wayne fixated on one word, masses. To Wayne, the specific vocabulary was the tell. He didn't believe Dmytryk's denial. History would eventually side with Wayne's instincts more than his accusation. Dmytryk was, at the time, an actual member of the Communist Party of the United States and would be blacklisted by the House Un-American Activities Committee within a few years. Wayne was wrong about almost every specific detail of what he thought was happening. He was right that something real was underneath it. Here is the detail that turns Fact 13 from an interesting anecdote into something close to historical irony. Edward Dmytryk and Ben Barsman, the two men John Wayne confronted on the set of Back to Bataan over suspected communist sympathies, were both later swept up in the House Un-American Activities Committee investigations of the late 1940s and early 1950s. Dmytryk became one of the Hollywood 10, briefly imprisoned for contempt of Congress before eventually testifying and naming names to resume his career. Barsman refused to cooperate, was blacklisted, and relocated to Europe to continue working under pseudonyms. John Wayne, meanwhile, became one of the most visible and active anti-communist figures in the Hollywood establishment, a founding member of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization explicitly built to combat the influence Wayne believed he detected on the set of this very film. The man who confronted Dmytryk over a single word in 1944 spent the following decade helping to formalize the exact process that would end Dmytryk's and Barsman's careers. The argument that started on the set of Back to Bataan didn't end when filming wrapped. It became American film history. This fact sits in direct tension with the previous two, and that tension is the point. Despite confronting Dmytryk and effectively accusing him of running a communist operation on set, John Wayne developed a genuinely friendly relationship with both Dmytryk and Barsman during production. Norma Barsman, Ben Barsman's wife, recalled a specific moment that captures the strangeness perfectly. Wayne hugging her husband warmly and calling him a goddamned communist, affectionately as a kind of running joke, to which Barsman jokingly shot back that Wayne was a fascist. Two men who would, within a few years, be on opposite sides of one of the most consequential political purges in Hollywood history were, during the actual production of this film, hugging each other and trading insults as terms of endearment. Wayne also developed real respect for Dmytryk's talent as a director, a respect he maintained even while publicly stating in later years that he regretted making the film once he learned Dmytryk had joined the Communist Party. The friendship was real. The politics were real. Both things were true on the same set, often on the same day. If you just realized the guy yelling communist at his own director would spend the next decade making sure that word ended careers, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment. Was Wayne's instinct here justified paranoia, or did he get lucky being right for the wrong reasons? Argue it out below now. Back to the jungle. Colonel George S. Clark wasn't just the source of the religious mockery conflict. He created a separate, much stranger dispute entirely on his own. When the production's makeup and costume departments deliberately dirtied the clothing worn by Filipino characters, standard practice for a war film depicting guerrilla fighters living in jungle conditions for years, Clark rejected it. His objection, recorded by Dmytryk, was that the Filipino people were the world's cleanest people, and the production's attempt at gritty realism was, in Clark's view, an insult to the population he had spent most of his career serving alongside. Clark had served in the Philippines for years and had been one of the few American officers evacuated before the surrender to Japan. His loyalty to the Filipino people was genuine and deeply personal, deep enough that he was willing to fight a Hollywood costume department over the cleanliness of fictional jungle fatigues. According to Dmytryk, Clark also held General MacArthur in contempt, a striking contrast to Wayne, who held what Dmytryk described as unshakable faith in the general. The film's own technical advisor disagreed with its leading man about the central, heroic figure of the entire Pacific campaign, and disagreed with its costume department about dirt. Among the stranger anecdotes Dmytryk carried away from the production was one that never made it anywhere near the screen. Dmytryk recalled multiple drunken attempts engineered by the nephew of a manager the two stars apparently shared to provoke John Wayne into physically fighting Johnny Weissmuller, the Olympic swimmer turned actor best known for playing Tarzan, and one of the few men in Hollywood with a physical profile that could plausibly be set against Wayne's. The attempts were, by Dmytryk's account, repeated more than once. They never succeeded. Picture it for a second. Two of the most physically iconic men in American cinema at the time, both at the peak of their respective screen personas, separated only by a few drinks and a meddling nephew with apparently nothing better to do on a remote location shoot. The fight that never happened would have been, by any measure, one of the strangest unrecorded moments in Hollywood history. Two icons of masculine spectacle, brawling not for a camera, not for a script, but because someone's relative thought it would be funny. Dmytryk also recalled something else about Wayne during this period that contradicted the tough guy image entirely. An unexpected physical grace, a lightness of movement that surprised people who only knew Wayne from the deliberate, weighted way he carried himself on screen. Maybe that's exactly why the fight never happened. Wayne might have simply been too graceful to bother. Ducky Louie played Maximo Cuenca, a Filipino schoolboy whose storyline becomes the emotional core of the film's final act. Captured and tortured by Japanese forces, Maximo is forced to lead them toward Colonel Madden's hideout. Rather than betray his allies, the character grabs the steering wheel of the truck he's being held in and drives it off an embankment, killing himself, his captors, and warning the resistance fighters of the ambush in the same act. It is, by any measure, one of the most harrowing things asked of a child actor in 1940s Hollywood, and multiple contemporary reviewers singled out Louis' performance as the standout of the entire film. Louis was born in Berkeley, California, in 1931, making him roughly 14 during filming. He continued acting for several more years. Black Gold in 1947, Smuggler's Island in 1951, and then did something almost nobody from this era of child acting managed. He simply left. He became a dentist, married, had 2 children, and by all available accounts lived a long, ordinary, professionally accomplished life entirely outside the industry that had, for one film, asked a young teenager to perform his own death by self-sacrifice for the camera. Actor John Miljon played General Jonathan "Skinny" Wainwright in Back to Bataan, the real American general who had commanded the defense of Corregidor after MacArthur's withdrawal, and who had been forced to surrender all Allied forces in the Philippines in May 1942. In the film, Wainwright appears as a character giving Madden his orders, a figure of weary command authority sending the hero into the hills to fight on. It's a brief appearance, but it anchors the entire premise of the film. Everything Madden does afterward happens because this man, on screen, told him to. At the moment this film was released in May 1945, the real Jonathan Wainwright had been a prisoner of war for 3 years. He had been held in increasingly brutal conditions across Luzon, then transported to Formosa, then finally to a camp in Manchuria, as Japanese forces relocated high-value prisoners further from the front as the war turned against them. Wainwright would not be released until August 1945. Months after Back to Bataan had already premiered in 2 cities on opposite sides of the Pacific when Soviet forces advancing into Manchuria liberated the camp where he was being held. The years of captivity had taken a visible toll. The man nicknamed Skinny was, by the time of his release, genuinely emaciated. The nickname had stopped being an affectionate exaggeration and become a literal description. The film depicted a real, living general as a confident authority figure issuing orders with calm certainty, while the actual man was, at that exact moment, starving in a prison camp whose location was unknown to most of the people who would eventually watch this film. When Wainwright finally came home, he was celebrated as the hero of Corregidor in headlines across the country, a few months after a movie had already cast an actor to play him as exactly that, before anyone knew if he'd live to hear about it. Back to Bataan opens with a title card explicitly thanking the United States Armed Forces for their assistance in the production. This wasn't a courtesy credit. The film's closing sequences feature what were presented as real survivors of the Bataan Death March and the Cabanatuan raid marching alongside the fictional cast in the film's final scenes. Actual men who had endured one of the worst atrocities of the Pacific War appeared on screen in a commercial Hollywood production within months of their ordeal ending. The blending of documentary reality and studio fiction in Back to Bataan goes further than most war films of its era even attempted. Real survivors, a real general played by an actor while the real man remained a prisoner, a real raid dramatized while its aftermath was still unfolding, a real ongoing war providing plot points faster than the writers could finalize them. The film functions less like a traditional narrative and more like a fictional frame hastily built around documentary material that was still being generated as the cameras rolled. Few films before or since have had this little distance between the events depicted and the moment of filming. Back to Bataan made approximately $2.49 million at the box office against a modest production budget, generating a profit margin of roughly 36% for RKO, a genuinely solid commercial return for a studio that was, at the time, one of the smaller players among the major Hollywood studios. Part of how this profitability was achieved is almost the opposite of what you'd expect from a film about authenticity and wartime sacrifice. RKO simply didn't have access to the equipment the story required. The Japanese forces depicted throughout the film are seen using American military equipment because in 1945, RKO's prop department had no Japanese equipment available to use. It was wartime, such material wasn't circulating through Hollywood supply chains, and there was neither the time nor the budget to manufacture convincing substitutes. Audiences who noticed this at the time generally let it go. Audiences watching decades later, with more reference material available, have noticed it considerably more, and some have treated it as a flaw in the production's research. It wasn't a research failure, it was a wartime supply chain failure dressed as a movie. The production leaned heavily on stock footage, practical effects, and a guerrilla-style approach to shooting that minimized expenditure while still delivering the spectacle audiences wanted. A film about scarcity, made under genuine scarcity, that turned its own limitations into the production model that made it profitable. The Japanese army on screen is, quite literally, equipped like the Americans they're fighting, because that's what was sitting in the prop warehouse. RKO didn't solve this problem. They just shipped the film anyway, and the box office didn't seem to mind. RKO staged two separate premieres for Back to Bataan on June 25th, 1945, one in Boston, one in Honolulu. The choice of cities wasn't arbitrary. Boston represented the mainland American audience, the home front constituency the film's patriotic messaging was aimed at. Honolulu represented something else entirely, a city that had been directly attacked by Japan, the literal starting point of the war the film depicted, premiering a film about that war's most humiliating chapter and its eventual reversal, 4 years almost to the week after Pearl Harbor. Both premieres happened on the same calendar day, separated by roughly 4,800 miles and 5 time zones, for a film that had been shot while the war it dramatized was still active, that incorporated real events as they happened, and that depicted a real general while he remained a prisoner of an enemy that had not yet surrendered. The dual premiere strategy wasn't just marketing. It was the film acknowledging, in its own release pattern, that it existed simultaneously in two different relationships to the war. One as entertainment for people who had only read about it, and one as something considerably more raw for people who had lived through its opening shots. Anthony Quinn played Captain Andres Bonifacio, the grandson of a real Filipino revolutionary martyr, a man whose entire arc in the film is defined by uncertainty about his role, his loyalties, and whether the Americans he's fighting alongside will ever actually return in the numbers they promised. The film's emotional through-line depends on Filipino characters voicing genuine, pointed disillusionment, wondering aloud why America, having promised salvation, sends so little of it. This is, by any measure, a remarkably candid thread to weave through a film explicitly thanked by the US military and built to inspire patriotic fervor on the home front. The Filipino characters aren't simply grateful supporting players waiting for American heroes to arrive. They question the value of the alliance, openly on screen in a major studio release while the actual war was still being fought. Quinn, himself of Mexican and Irish descent, playing a Filipino character in a film about Filipino resistance, gave voice to exactly the kind of doubt that a pure propaganda piece should have had no room for. The film smuggled in a genuinely uncomfortable question inside its rousing exterior, and almost nobody who saw it in 1945 was positioned to notice. This is the fact that reframes the entire film. Back to Bataan builds toward an ending that depends, structurally and emotionally, on the audience's relationship to two real men. General Douglas MacArthur, whose actual return to the Philippines was incorporated into the film as it happened, and General Jonathan Wainwright, who appears as a character giving the hero his orders. MacArthur's return was real and recent, audiences had seen it in newsreels, the film could lean on that shared knowledge directly. Wainwright was different. At the moment Back to Bataan premiered in Boston and Honolulu on June 25, 1945, the real Jonathan Wainwright, the man John Miljan was playing, the man whose authority the film's hero operates under, was an emaciated prisoner of war in Japanese custody in Manchuria, 3 years into a captivity that had broken his health and left his fate, genuinely uncertain to the American public. He had no knowledge that a film existed depicting him. He had no knowledge of how the war he'd been removed from for 3 years had actually progressed. He would be liberated by Soviet forces in August 1945, 2 months after the premiere, and would return home to a hero's welcome that the film, in its own small way, had already started building before he even knew he'd survived to receive it. A movie about returning to the Philippines, built around real men and real events happening in real time, had already finished telling part of one man's story before he was free enough to know it had been told. Back to Bataan wasn't just shot during the war, it got ahead of it, so there you have it. 15 weird facts about a film whose title was changed to sound more triumphant, whose script was rewritten by an actual war in progress, whose star refused every stunt double they tried to scare him with, whose director and writer would later be blacklisted for the exact thing its star accused them of on set, while remaining genuinely friendly with him the whole time, and whose emotional ending depended on a real general who didn't know the movie existed because he was still a prisoner of war when it premiered. The 14-year-old who carried the film's most devastating scene grew up to become a dentist. The Japanese army on screen is wearing American equipment because that's what was in the warehouse. And two premieres happened on the same day on opposite sides of the Pacific, 4 years almost to the week after the war that started there. Like, subscribe and share this with whoever in your life still thinks war movies made during an actual war can't also be strange, contradictory, and quietly honest about things they're not supposed to say out loud. This one managed all three before anyone involved had any idea how the story actually ended. Until next time, General MacArthur has already returned. The movie just had to catch up.